I was seduced by television. And in a completely different direction, totally accidentally. It was simply that a former student of mine, in 1977, a former student of mine, a man called Charles Kitchen, he'd been intended to go into the RAF, the Royal Air Force. He was a cadet, that's to say, he would have been paid a modest salary whilst he was a student, which of course made him much more prosperous than the typical student. You knew he was interested in the RAF because he always wore what was called a Pratt rag, some kind of cravat thing round his neck, and had slight Battle of Britain affectations. But then once he actually joined the RAF, he discovered there were dreadful things, like the fact you're expected to be sober before you flew a plane. To go to the gym occasionally. Decided this wasn't for him. So he joined Granada, one of our, in those days, there were regional ITV companies, and that was the one for the Northwest, which was the most famous, the most effective. And his first job was to find a historian for a program. And it was an extraordinary program. We won't go into detail on it. It's barely possible to do so decently. But it's our first piece in 1977, the first piece of reality television in the country, fronted by a man, extraordinary man, called Russell Harty. It was called Behave Yourself, which meant it was all really about misbehaving. And the idea of the program was you got a group of people from a real-life Coronation Street, very famous soap opera in Oldham, and you got them in a studio and you got them drunk and you got them talking about work and sex and clothes and sex and jobs and sex and sex. And you treated them, I mean, nowadays it's inconceivable, the degree of patronage. You treated them rather like as though you were anthropologists visiting a strange tribe. And so you got in a group of experts, it's really true, to comment on them. We literally had an animal behaviourist, Nick Humphrey from King's College at Cambridge. We had the then head of the anthropological department of the British Museum. We had a leading Harley Street psychiatrist, and they wanted a historian. And Charles's job was to get the historian, and he hesitated and hesitated and hesitated. And finally, the director of the programme, John Slater, a man exercised a very important, in some ways malign, other ways beneficial influence in my life, very physical. You know. And Charles has been hesitating. John grabs him by the lapels, back again. And finally, after much toing and throwing, Charles says, well, none of them are very much, historians at Cambridge, John said, heaven's sake, you were at Cambridge, you must have seen the brightest and the best. None of them were much good, but I suppose Starkey was the least boring. And that took me into a career in television. And again, that developed different aspects of myself. That's why, because I was spending so much time on that was why Conrad Russell, it's why I've never written, which I should have done, my great book on the court of Henry VIII. I've written lots of other things, but I've never fulfilled the early promise of that research. I'm prepared to admit it, because I was seduced. Why was I seduced? It's suddenly a world of money, of open drinks cabinets, of fun, of, I came from a very modest background, and back in the day, then we're talking about in the 1970s, it was a world when independent television was making money hand over fist. Harold Wilson had tried to tax it by introducing a special profits tax. Well, it's very simple. You don't make a profit, do you? Instead, every drinks cabinet was open. You went out to the most unimaginable meals. In 1977, we went out to a meal in what was then Manchester's only decent restaurant, Truffles, which cost, it was allegedly the only time an expenses claim was ever queried at Granada. It cost £600. When I had been a research fellow at Cambridge up to 1972, I was paid £600 a year. Admittedly, I had my board and lodging. You could buy a flat in London at the beginning of 1973 for £3,000, a one-bedroom flat. So that gives you an idea. So suddenly, this world, and of course it played up to the fact that I've always enjoyed acting. I was a good schoolboy actor, enjoyed debating, language and whatever. And then that led, and so I'm taking you on this path through a really very zigzaggy sort of career. Then, of course, as you get better known, I started to comment. I was invited to commentate, hideous word, on the monarchy. Remember, this is the moment at which, with the tensions and then the breakup of the marriage and then the death of the Prince and Princess of Wales and then the death of Diana, there was huge interest. And nobody really knew anything about it because there was a whole group of royal commentators and all they could tell you about was, what woman was wearing what coloured hat. There'd been very, very little serious interest in monarchy. It was, remember, academics in the post-war period go wildly to the left. There is the fashion for it's a sort of unthinking neo-leftism, the assumption that history is the history of the people. That the aristocracy and monarchy, these are simply a sort of discarded superstructure in neo-Marxist language or whatever. So everything was looking at the common people, looking at trade unions. I mean, I remember when I studied the history of the 19th century at Cambridge, it was completely killed for me by the fact that the history of Britain's great imperial expansion, the reconstruction of our cities, the transformation of industry, the extraordinary conquest of the world by the navy and then the great commercial ship, all of that stuff. What was I taught? I was taught by Henry Pilling about the bloody history of the early Labour Party and trade unions. It was the most tedious stuff. Anyway, it meant that I, who had worked on the royal court, I, who was interested in the role of monarchy, for me it was just natural to slip into the role of royal commentator. And then I got into things like the beginning of my role as a controversialist, with the moral maze. Again, I remember my title of the rudest man in Britain, which I was given by that unimpeachable source of the Daily Mail, was because I had actually defended Prince Charles against a man called George Austin, had a very grand title in the Church of England, though it didn't actually mean very much. He was Archdeacon of York, and he'd been attacking Prince Charles for his immorality and whatever returning to Camilla and whatever. And I've never much liked moralism in public life. When people start proclaiming virtue, then you actually know politics is going to turn bloody and nasty. And somebody like Keir Starmer parading virtue, you know there's something really, really nasty underneath. Anyway, so Austin, this was on the moral maze, Austin had delivered himself as some enormous, flatulent diatribe. And as he was leaving the studio, I developed this art of doing a kind of, remember radio? We've now got the business, it's very easy to produce images with text. In those days it wasn't, remember. When I started filming, when I started making television, we're talking about from 77, and then I made my first documentaries in 83, you still used film stock. Immensely expensive and whatever. This is easy, quick, we can afford to do it. Effectively, in student, you can afford to do it. Effectively, in student digs, then you simply couldn't. But I developed in radio where you've got no image, because now they even film radio studios, as people are talking. You couldn't do it. So I came up with this technique of what is really a verbal cartoon. using words to conjure an image. I was talking about the importance of monarchy. Again, image is so important. It's why the cartoon, why the captioned photograph. I mean, one of the reasons we remember Diana is she had an uncanny ability to do a pose which the Sun would write a brilliant headline for. So, you know, when she's in front of the Taj Mahal, like that, alone, you know, the word "there's three in the marriage," all of this stuff. She was brilliant at that. Anyway, and I was good in the creation of what I call the verbal cartoon. So as Austen, who was, you know, a fat and sweaty priest, was bumbling his way out of the studio, I came up with the line, listen to it carefully, the English is interesting, doesn't his fatness, his smugness, and his pomposity make you want to vomit? Now, look at that line. It's the fatness, the smugness, English, and then suddenly the Latin, pomposity. And do you know what? I felt so ashamed. That line figured as the centre of poor old George Austen's obituary in the Times. And I thought, really, he was going a bit far. But and of course at that point you become famous. Hence the rudest man in Britain. And I suppose in some ways, again, let me be honest about myself, I've rather played up to that. And to begin with, like a Katie Hopkins or whatever, there was an element of doing it for its own sake.